I will live to piss on his grave. Even if I'm in a walker, my wife already has instructions. She's out of the will. If she doesn't get me there, if I'm not ambulatory, I'll find Vince Russo's grave and I will piss on it, and there will be a picture of that hanging on my wall when I pass away. And hate is a hell of a motivator.
Hate is a very strong word, but for the purposes of this video, hate isn't strong enough. I love listening to Jim Cornette shoots. Whether you agree with his opinions or not, he's very entertaining when he's ranting about someone until you feel like his heart rate is in danger. When listening to his shoots, there seems to be one name that comes up a lot: Vince Russo. The more I started listening to these shoots, I realised something. Jim Cornette doesn't really like Vince Russo very much.
When I got in the elevator, I saw a bloody spot of where I'd pinned my knuckles, where I'd punched the wall thinking of fucking Russo, fucking Russo, fucking Russo, right?
I wonder how Vince Russo feels about Jim Cornette.
Bro, this guy, something's not right upstairs.
He doesn't like him very much either. Ah, well. Why? Why do they not get on? Why? Well, it's a long story. Let's get into it. Jim Cornette was a fan of wrestling. Since the age of 9, he installed an antenna on top of his roof just to watch wrestling. Maybe a bit of porn as well, you know. He was a massive wrestling fan who started working in wrestling at the age of 14 as a photographer, ring announcer, timekeeper, magazine correspondent, and public relations correspondent. He did so many jobs in wrestling as a teenager, some of them seem like they're made up. He did more jobs before he attained all of his pubes than Goldberg did over his whole career. By the age of 21, he was a manager, and he was brilliant at it. He became one of the best managers of all time, and managed one of the biggest tag teams in the wrestling business, the Midnight Express. They were so big that Alan Parker even made a film about them. He put his all into his career, and within 4 years, he was managing the Midnight Express against the Road Warriors in one of the headline matches at the biggest show of the year, Starrcade. He ascended the wrestling business in the time it's taken me to not even... Well, I mean, you already know. One of the reasons he was that good was because he was dedicated. He was so dedicated that during this match at Starrcade, he tore all of the ligaments in one of his knees. He broke his bone and damaged his cartilage when he fell from scaffolding into the ring. See, that's why you should always wait for a stadium to be finished before you hold an event in it. What are you doing? What are you doing wrestling when there's still scaffolding over the ring? What are you doing? However, Jim Cornette loved wrestling so much, he continued in the wrestling business despite this, coming back to be a manager and continuing to give his all to the business. He was also a colour commentator, booker, and in 1991 he started his own wrestling promotion, Smoky Mountain Wrestling. He got Rick Rubin to be an investor. What a geezer Rick Rubin is, what a geezer. Eventually the business closed down and he sold the rights and the videos of Smoky Mountain to WWF and went to work for the WWF in 1995. He would work for them in several roles, including as a manager, as a commentator, and as part of the creative team. Vince Russo, he was also a wrestling fan. He graduated with a degree in journalism and owned 2 video stores and hosted a wrestling radio show. One day he wrote a letter to Linda McMahon, and Linda said, this bloke seems like a geezer, get him on board. He became a writer for the WWF magazine, then became part of the WWF creative team, and in one of those creative meetings, Jim Cornette and Vince Russo would meet for the first time in 1997. On the 3rd of March 1997, Raw was held in Germany, and he didn't do very well. The WWF was like the opposite of Jadon Sancho. They went to Germany and their prospects seemed worse. So the week after, McMahon was annoyed at the low ratings for this show in Germany and the poor business the company had been doing for the last few years, and thought they needed a change in direction. And Vince Russo certainly had a change in direction. This is where Vince Russo and Jim Cornette first came into conflict. They would have to sit in meetings together with Vince McMahon, Bruce Pritchard and Jim Ross and pitch ideas for storylines. Now, Vince Russo and Jim Cornette have different views on wrestling. Jim Cornette has more of a traditional view, where feuds and storylines are meant to build up conflict between two or more people, so when they eventually wrestle, the audience is invested in the outcome of the match, more than they would do for just a normal sporting context without any of this drama. However, Vince Russo doesn't appear to be concerned with wrestling matches themselves or what the storylines mean to them. For Vince Russo, the storylines are the entertainment, and the more shocking they are, the more enjoyable the audience will find them. Jim Cornette was taken aback by Vince Russo's ideas and his lack of appreciation for pacing or if the storylines made sense. At first, he thought he could teach Vince Russo how to write wrestling, and since Vince McMahon was always there to mediate, they got on. But the more they're in these meetings, the further apart they grew, as Jim Cornette had to listen to more and more of Vince Russo's outrageous ideas, and Vince Russo would run into more and more opposition from Jim Cornette and his traditional view of wrestling. Once in a hallway, when Jim Cornette complained to Vince Russo about the high number of disqualifications in a show, Vince Russo said it was just a wrestling show. Who cares? To which Jim Cornette said, "You'll care when you're back running your loser video store in a few weeks."
DQ. So I go up to Vince and I'm like, "Vince, we got 8 matches, 7 are DQs." He DQ, schmeq, nobody cares in front of all the boys, and everybody walks off from me. Like I'm, fucking some job guy. I say, "Okay, you're gonna care, motherfucker, when you're back running a video store in 4 years or 3 years." And I was off by a year.
Oh, this is Vince Russo. You said Vince said
Yeah,
Vince
Vince Russo. Yeah,
okay.
Vince Russo.
Not only did yelling at each other in front of people embarrass each other, but it also highlights the main reason for their feud. Jim Cornette took wrestling a whole lot more seriously than Vince Russo. Jim Cornette described himself as a wrestling historian, who has a vast collection of different wrestling memorabilia and tapes in his house. He detailed his long career in a diary he wrote to celebrate his career. Vince Russo also wrote a book called How the Wrestling Business Killed Vince Russo. Enraged by what Vince Russo was doing to his beloved wrestling, Jim Cornette asked to be taken off the booking team. Vince Russo claims Cornette being removed from the booking team may be another reason Cornette was bitter towards him. However, if defacing Cornette's wrestling wasn't bad enough, his writing would actually have bad effects on the on-screen talent themselves who were friends of Jim Cornette. There was a time in WCW where Ed Ferrara, Vince Russo's writing partner, imitated wrestling commentator Jim Ross on air, making fun of his Bell's palsy. There was the Brawl for All tournament, where wrestlers would fight each other for real, and several of the wrestlers would actually get hurt physically, as well as their career prospects getting hurt, as the fancied Dr. Death Steve Williams lost to Bart Gunn, and then Bart Gunn was then buried for winning the tournament for some reason. There was the death of Owen Hart after a malfunction with a harness during a show as he attempted to rappel from the ceiling to add to his superhero gimmick, the Blue Blazer, which led to him falling to his death on a WWF pay-per-view. Jim Cornette has changed his story on whether he blamed Vince Russo directly for Owen Hart's death, as he booked the Blue Blazer gimmick, but it defo didn't strengthen their relationship. What may have also angered Jim Cornette is that under Vince Russo's time as head writer of the WWF, the company went from being in financial trouble to becoming more successful than they ever had been before. And Vince Russo was happy to take the credit, ignoring the other factors that led to this success that Jim Cornette is all too happy to point out, like the production team, the fact they had one of the best commentators of all time calling the matches, the fact they had 2 of the biggest stars in wrestling come along at the same time, an unprecedented feat. Jim Cornette, as I said before, is very traditional, and he had certain rules that he didn't break in the wrestling business, such as don't no-show, don't work opposition.
He said, "No," he said, "Corny, I'm not going to take your notice. If you don't come back, it means that you're no-showing." And he knows, now he's getting me my old-fashionedness, right? Don't work opposition, don't no-show.
Vince Russo broke these rules on the 5th of October 1999, when he and his writing partner Ed Ferrara went over to their rivals WCW.
They go to Atlanta, they sign the contracts. They fly back to Connecticut, where they both live now. Vince Russo has a house in Trumbull or whatever the fuck it is. Vince McMahon comes back the following day, straight into the Meadowlands for TV. Meadowlands, Trumbull, Connecticut, 60 miles. Even in New York traffic, I would have done it. Vince Russo didn't have the balls, didn't have the guts, didn't have the decency, didn't have the common courtesy to get his fucking ass in that car and drive to the Meadowlands and walk up to Vince McMahon and say, Vince, they offered me so much fucking money that I couldn't turn them down, and I appreciate it, it's been fun, here's a hearty handshake. He called him on the fucking phone. Vince McMahon gets a phone call at whatever time of day. Oh, by the way, your head writer is not only not coming to your national television tonight, but he just took a job with your competitor.
Vince Russo has said the motivation for moving to WCW came from the extra workload Vince McMahon asked him to do when he asked him to also write SmackDown. And he was doing this without offering a pay rise. And when Vince Russo asked when he'd get time to see his kids, Vince McMahon said they can always get a sitter. Also, WCW were paying him $2.5 million a year for 4 years. So that was a bit of the motivation as well, you know. While in WCW, Vince Russo wrote even more mad storylines that Jim Cornette felt devalued wrestling and made a mockery of it. Well, I wonder why you thought that. On WCW, they would even repeatedly make reference to the fact that wrestling was, as pricks say, fake. Yes, I know it's fake now, fuck off. In Vince Russo's eyes, he was just doing the job he was paid to do. He was trying to make good television, giving the audience something they hadn't seen before in wrestling, by completely pulling back the curtain. However, unlike other examples of pulling back a curtain, this didn't provide pleasure and stimulation, especially not to Jim Cornette. While in WCW, Vince Russo wanted to make contact with someone from WWF he used to work with. This led to Jim Cornette getting past Vince Russo's phone number. And Jim Cornette rang him up and berated him. It was almost as bad as some of the comments I get for my videos. When Vince Russo hung up, Jim Cornette rang him again and kept berating him. Vince Russo was understandably offended by this verbal attack and spoke to WWF's HR department. He said to them that Jim Cornette wanted to sexually assault his wife and that Jim Cornette wished harm on him and his kids. Jim Cornette has said that Vince Russo's claims are untrue. I mean, he did want to harm Vince Russo, but not his kids. And he didn't want to do anything to his wife. I suppose we'll never know what was actually said on those phone calls, but needless to say, they both didn't like each other. WCW went out of business, something which Jim Cornette and many wrestling fans have blamed Vince Russo for. That's a debate for another video, and there's several of them. There you go, there's a free plug for you. Feel free to return the favour. Jim Cornette continued to work for the WWE and started another wrestling promotion, OVW, which worked as a feeder system to the WWE, while Vince Russo worked for a new wrestling company started by Jeff and Jerry Jarrett called TNA. And again, Vince Russo wrote even more outrageous storylines, and then he got fired. There are several cultural differences between Jim Cornette and Vince Russo.
See, we couldn't be any more opposite. We are diametrically opposed. We are the bizarro component of each other.
One of the biggest is that Jim Cornette is from the south of America. Not the Latin bit, but the historically backwards bit.
He's a northerner, I'm a southerner.
However, in October 2003, there was another big cultural difference between Jim Cornette and Vince Russo. Jim Cornette was an atheist. He's not a massive fan of the old religion, and in 2003, Vince Russo became a born-again Christian.
He's a Christian, I'm an atheist.
He even created his own Christian wrestling promotion, Ring of Glory. I can imagine their ring bells must have sounded beautiful. Religion was another thing that pushed Jim Cornette and Vince Russo apart. When Jim Cornette and WWF parted ways, Jim Cornette went to work for TNA. Jim Cornette was a family friend of the Jarretts, and he wanted an alternative wrestling company to the WWE for the betterment of the wrestling business. Things were going well. TNA had great wrestlers, Jim Cornette was getting paid well, Liverpool won the Champions League and the FA Cup. Things were going good. Then, on the 21st of September 2006, Jim Cornette hears that TNA have made a new hire. Vince Russo. Jim Cornette wasn't very happy. Vince Russo was very much becoming like the Sam Allardyce of wrestling at this point, trading on past success, coming into a struggling organisation to try and get them out of trouble, to continually worse results. This time, Jim Cornette purposely tried to avoid Vince Russo, knowing how much Vince Russo got under his skin. Vince Russo would continue with his outrageous writing and storylines that Jim Cornette would have to continue to make sense of in production meetings and explain to the talent in a way that would make sense. They worked together for 3 years, and during that time, they only spoke to each other once. The time that they spoke to each other was when wrestler Hernandez was booked to lose to Sting in the main event of an Impact show. The problem was, Sting was an icon, and Hernandez was a guy that TNA were trying to push as their next big babyface, so either one losing wouldn't be very good. Sting was also in his 50s, so losing to him would seriously damage Hernandez's credibility. They had to have the match, but Jim Cornette rang Vince Russo to pitch having a disqualification finish so it wouldn't hurt either guy. Vince Russo agreed. However, the next day at the production meeting, when Jim Cornette arrived, he found out they changed it back to Sting winning, and made the finish even more complicated. Jim Cornette then made them change it again. However, soon after, Jim Cornette was fired by TNA for not being 100% behind creative. The president of TNA, Dixie Carter, said it had nothing to do with Vince Russo. However, Jim Cornette didn't believe this, and thinks Vince Russo badmouthed Jim Cornette to Dixie Carter. A story broke out that the reason Jim Cornette was fired was because in a meeting when Vince Russo pitched to push Eric Young, who was a great wrestler, however was booked as a comedy wrestler for the last few years previous, Jim Cornette got mad and started complaining, and Vince Russo said it was no big deal, but Jim Cornette kept going, and co-workers complained about Jim Cornette's behaviour. Jim Cornette said this didn't happen and got TNA to issue an apology. Again, what was said in that meeting, I'm sure we'll never know. Vince Russo would soon also be fired from TNA. Jim Cornette also might have been mad because Vince Russo was arguably the reason TNA lost their TV deal on Spike TV, as Dixie Carter lied to Spike TV saying Vince Russo wasn't working for TNA. However, he was, as a consultant. Vince Russo then mistakenly sent an email meant for TNA commentator Mike Tenay instead to Mike Johnston, who worked for the pro wrestling publication Pro Wrestling Insider, and the story got out. Again, you could argue Vince Russo ruined another wrestling company. I imagine Jim Cornette would argue that. And he sort of did argue that, among other things, in an email he sent in 2010. In 2010, Jim Cornette sent an old friend Terry Taylor an email in which he said, "I'll say it because I'm trying to quell the burning in my heart. I hate Vince Russo. I despise Vince Russo. I want Vince Russo to die. If I could figure out a way to murder him without going to prison, I would. Consider it the greatest accomplishment of my life. I hate him for the money he's cost me. I hate him for what he's done to the business. I hate him for keeping TNA from being competitive to WWE. I hate him for the careers, even the lives he's ruined with his shitty booking and the irreparable damage he's done to every promotion he's been involved with. I regularly wake up from dreams in which I am in the act of murdering him. I literally burn whenever I think of him. I have sworn to myself that I will willingly go to jail if I ever see him in person again. and he had better pray to his fictitious, invisible man in the sky that the day never comes. I intend to make it my life's work and mission to fuck with him and anything he ever has anything to do with in the wrestling business. He wrote it thinking, there's no way Vince Russo will ever see this. This is just a violent graphic rant between friends. Anyway, so Terry Taylor sent the email to Vince Russo. And this was one of the big things that led to Vince Russo getting the law involved in this feud. The second was an incident in 2017. Vince Russo and Jim Cornette both had podcasts and took shots at each other over the years. However, in 2017, Jim Cornette offered Vince Russo $5,000 if he could take it from him. No guns, no knives, no cops, whatever happens, happens. Which is either Jim Cornette challenging Vince Russo to a fight, or the strangest sexual proposition I've ever heard. In June 2017, Vince Russo got a restraining order out against Jim Cornette. To this day, Jim Cornette and Vince Russo will still speak about each other from time to time, and they seem to dislike each other as much as they ever did. So let's get to the question. Why did Vince Russo and Jim Cornette not like each other? Well, there's the cultural differences. Certainly there's the high pressured environment of the wrestling business and live TV, but I would say the biggest reason they don't like each other is their views, or rather how they viewed one specific thing. How they viewed the wrestling business. For Vince Russo, wrestling is just a job. He was a wrestling fan, it has paid him very well, and he continues to make money talking about wrestling. However, for Jim Cornette, wrestling is more than a passion. It's more than a job. It's everything to him. It's his life. It's what he loved growing up. What he dreamed of getting into. What he dedicated his life to. Something he wants to be remembered for. Something he wants to see be as good as it can be. And to him, Vince Russo is the man who fucked it up. The man who exposed the business, mocked the business, and fucked over countless members of the wrestling business, whether directly or indirectly, with his writing and actions, many of those people close friends to Jim Cornette. Is Jim Cornette right to act the way he's acted toward Vince Russo? No, I wouldn't say so. When the court's getting involved, it's usually not good. But after researching the story, I can understand how you can have disdain for someone who wrecks the thing you love. And so that's why Jim Cornette and Vince Russo don't like each other. At least I reckon. I don't know, I haven't spoke to any of these blokes. It might be something else, I don't know. But anyway, that's why I think it is.